All right, good morning, class. Today we're going to talk about the causes and effects of the events that led up to the American Revolution. We talked about this a little bit last week, but we're just going to continue it today and go into more detail about the different acts. So as you can see on this first slide, 1754 to 1800 is the time frame that these occurred. You'll see specific dates on the slideshow, but I'm not going to test you on those. I just want you to know the overall time frame. So make sure in your notes you put 1754 to 1800 and know that. All right, why people left England. We talked about it a little bit last week, like I said, and I mentioned some of the reasons people wanted to leave England to come to the New World. Does anyone remember any of those? Kayla. Very good. Religious freedom. That was definitely an important reason. Another main reason is people wanted to get out of England is because they had no status there, meaning they didn't have much money or any real reason to stay. People back in England didn't think very highly of them. Their parents hadn't had very much money, so they were lower class, and they wanted to free that society and the poverty that they were living in. They also wanted to get rich quick off of fertile lands. So when many people heard the term New World, the first thing they thought of was fresh soil that had never been used before, ways that they could plant crops easily, they would grow fast, they could sell them and make money and kind of make a life for themselves that they hadn't had back in England. Not only did they seek freedom from religion, as Kayla said, they also wanted social freedom, freedom from the economy in England, and geographic freedom. The colonists were made up of Puritans, Protestants, and Roman Catholics. Back in England, they were told what they should believe religion-wise, and so coming to the New World and having the colonies, they could practice anything they wanted. So Puritans, Protestants, and Roman Catholics were just the three of the things that the majority of them would practice. All right, when it came to social freedom, like I said before, they were often people who had no status in England. They no longer wanted to feel like they weren't good enough, and they wanted a way to start over and a second chance at life to make something of themselves. Does anyone have any questions? All right, let's move on to early settlements. So coming to the New World, people often had no idea what to expect. They thought it would be easier than it ended up being. This led to many of the early settlements' failure. So the first years were the most difficult because there was a lack of food. The soil wasn't as fertile as they thought it would be. It had already been used by the Indians who were there first. So the relationships they had with the Indians were very hostile, meaning that they didn't like the colonists very much. Disease spread fast because people didn't know how to take care of themselves in this new environment. So the leadership was often poor as well. This was another main reason that colonists failed. People like John Smith, we talked about him a little bit last week. He tried establishing order. These people that tried to lead the colonies had mixed success. Others were more successful, and eventually the first colony was created. It was called Jamestown, so make sure you know that for the test, Jamestown, Virginia. John Smith had tried to maintain order with the colonies, but ended up insulting many of the men in the colony that he led, so they ended up shipping him back to England. So that was just kind of the story with him. Like I said, Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, that was the first permanent settlement, but by 1776, 13 colonies had been created. All right, the colonists soon became sick of England's strict rule and thought that their taxations and regulations put on them were unfair and that they needed to be removed. So here's just a list of the acts placed on the colonies by England. I'll explain each of these in detail, so don't write them down yet. There was the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act, which took place in 1765, the Quartering Act of 1765 as well, Townshend Act of 1767, and the Tea Act of 1773. These weren't all of them, but they were the most heard of and the ones that caused the colonies to rebel and riot against the British government, eventually leading to the American Revolution. So to first start with the Sugar Act, this was one of the first ones. It was a 3-cent tax placed on many everyday things like coffee, indigo, and certain types of wine. This angered all of the colonists, but it mostly affected the merchants who sold these goods. So the store owners who sold coffee, indigo, and wine, it affected them the most because people didn't buy them as much as they used to because now it costs more. So they were very vocal about being upset about this. Not only within the colonies were they vocal, but they were also vocal with England. And another one that was placed on them was the Stamp Act. This came directly from England and the British government. So this was a tax placed on newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, most paper products actually. And the main reason this angered people is that these things had always been free to them and they were suddenly costing money, and the colonists didn't understand why or what the point of this tax was. They responded to it in force, and eventually, 11 years after the tax was created, England repealed it. Does anyone know what repealed means? Bobby. Exactly, yep, to take it back. So the act was taken back in 1776, and there was no longer a tax on these paper products. Okay, so the Quartering Act. This was, so troops were sent from England into the colonies to like maintain order and things like that. The Quartering Act said that the colonists had to give them a place to stay, give them food, bedding, firewood, beer and cider, and then candles, just everyday things that they would use. They were told that they would be paid back for this by England, however, they often weren't. So the colonists fought this act. They said that it violated their Bill of Rights and they were outraged. Their privacy was taken away, and since they weren't compensated, they were just very upset about this. All right, the Townshend Act was tax placed on everyday things, so things they use like glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. So that like included the Paper Act and the one place on tea, but these were just the everyday things. Colonists didn't take this well either, just like all of the other acts, and eventually it was repealed as well and taken back. Okay, can anybody tell me what a monopoly is? This was one of your vocab words. Well, all right, let's think about the game Monopoly, for example. What is the whole point of the game? So you want to get all of the spaces on like a certain side of the board so that whenever other players land on it, they owe you money, right? Exactly. All right, so this is kind of what happened back during the colonist time. England lowered the price of tea from one specific company called the East Indian Company. So people would only buy tea from them because it was cheaper. So there wasn't a vast place that this tea was coming from. It was mainly only coming from the East Indian Company because it was so much cheaper. So the people who were selling tea in the colonies got really upset because people weren't buying their tea anymore. So the next one, effects of these things. So all of these things brought about boycotts and uprising. Eventually it led to the Boston Tea Party, which I'll talk about next, and then the Boston Massacre. So these were two major events that brought about the revolution and kind of kick-started it. All right, so colonists began to boycott British tea, meaning they refused to buy it just to send the message to England that they were angry about these acts. So there was two different groups, one called the Daughters of Liberty and one called the Sons of Liberty. The Daughters of Liberty were women in the colonies who weren't afraid to revolt against the British government, and the men were the same. They weren't afraid to revolt. They used intimidation and threats to drive out the British tax collectors out of town. So the people who came from England to collect the tax money from all these different acts were driven out of town by the Sons of Liberty. The men would ransack the houses of British officials, and since the women were the ones kind of in charge of buying household items, they made sure to uphold the boycotts. So in your notes, you can have it as like the Daughters of Liberty were those who upheld boycotts, and Sons of Liberty ransacked houses of British officials and drove tax collectors out of town. The groups also had rituals, secret code words, medals, and symbols. So kind of sounds like cults, if you ask me. Does anyone have any questions? All right, moving on. The Boston Tea Party. This came about after the Tea Act had been in place. The colonists were still angry, so when the ships carrying tea cargo were sitting in the Boston harbor at night, the colonists decided to do something about it. So they dressed up as Indians, and in the middle of the night, they boarded these ships and dumped all of the crates of tea into the water to show their protest. All right, the Boston Massacre. Colonists gathered in the town center to revolt. They were throwing things like oyster shells, snowballs, and other debris at the soldiers. A stick hit one of the soldiers in the arm and he yelled fire, causing other soldiers to begin shooting. So the effects of this were 5 colonists dead and 6 wounded. This was another Kickstarter to the revolution. So the revolution begins. The American Revolution began not long after this. The colonists formed their own armies called militias, and these militias referred to themselves as Minutemen. So make sure you know for the test, Minutemen were just the militias formed by the colonies. At the first battle, 77 Minutemen prepared to fight about 250 British soldiers. So these Minutemen had no army experience, nothing like that, and there was only 77 of them about to face 250 soldiers who had been trained for this. So the first shot was fired, and although it's still unknown who fired the first shot, whether it was England or the colonists, it marked the start of the revolution. And there we have it. So that is the events that brought about the revolution. And we're going to have a project that we're going to do on it next week. We're going to make videos kind of like you're a news reporter. So like CNN or ABC News, Fox News, whatever. It'll be groups of 4. So I will count you off into 4s. And I'm going to pass out the paper for that right now. And next week in class, we'll have time to work on it. And I'll explain it a little bit more. So happy Friday, and everybody have a great weekend.